The Vrexian Empire had spent the last 4 centuries perfecting the art of looking down on everyone else in the galaxy, which was impressive considering they were a species of 8-foot-tall reptilian bipeds who already had a height advantage. Their military doctrine could be summarized as overwhelming force applied with theatrical flair, and their diplomatic strategy was essentially, agree with us, or we'll park a warship over your homeworld until you reconsider. It worked surprisingly well, mostly because the Vrexian fleet outnumbered most neighboring civilizations 3-1, and their ships had this unsettling habit of being exactly where you didn't want them to be. General Krelvax embodied everything the Vrexian Empire represented: ruthless efficiency wrapped in scales and arrogance. His service record read like a greatest hits compilation of military conquests: the siege of Talax IV, the blockade of the Kepler Belt, the rather memorable incident at Proxima Station that people still didn't talk about in polite company. 47 engagements, 47 victories, 0 tolerance for species who thought they deserved a seat at the big kids' table. His flagship, the Descending Wrath, was a testament to Vrexian subtlety, which is to say, it had all the subtlety of a meteor impact and roughly the same effect on property values. Humanity, by contrast, had stumbled into interstellar politics like a drunk guest at a wedding, late, underdressed, and vaguely apologetic about existing. Earth's first diplomatic mission had accidentally insulted 3 species, triggered 2 trade disputes, and somehow established a sister city program with a mining colony that didn't technically qualify as a city. But humans had one thing going for them. They were very, very good at needing things. Resources specifically. Rare earth elements, exotic materials. The kind of stuff that made faster-than-light travel possible and kept your ship's reactor from turning into a very expensive paperweight, which brought Ambassador Marcus Webb to Vrexian space on a Tuesday afternoon, Galactic Standard Time, aboard a diplomatic vessel that looked like someone had welded a conference room onto a cargo hauler and called it good enough. Marcus was what humanity generously called experienced, which meant he'd survived enough diplomatic disasters to know when he was walking into another one. He had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen things, terrible things, like budget meetings and committee hearings. The negotiation started badly and got worse from there, which was almost impressive in its efficiency. Marcus had come to discuss mining rights in the Threshold Expanse, a resource-rich region that humanity desperately needed, and the Vrexian Empire considered theirs by virtue of having more guns pointed at it. The conversation had been proceeding with all the warmth of a contract killing, when one of Krelvax's intelligence officers dropped a data slate on the conference table with the kind of dramatic timing usually reserved for courtroom dramas. "Explain this," Krelvax said, his voice like gravel being processed through a threat detector. The slate displayed surveillance footage of human survey ships in contested territory, the kind of footage that was very hard to explain away, as we were just passing through. Marcus, to his credit, barely flinched. Those are exploratory missions, standard procedure for evaluating potential partnership opportunities. Standard procedure, Krelvax repeated, tasting the words like something that had expired several weeks ago. You send military-grade sensor arrays into disputed space and call it exploratory. How charmingly human. You dress up espionage in civilian clothes and expect us to applaud your initiative. It's not espionage if we were planning to share the findings. You were planning nothing except calculating which resources you could steal before we noticed. Krelvax leaned forward, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Ambassador Webb, you are hereby detained pending investigation of intelligence operations conducted in violation of the Outer Spiral Accords. Your vessel will be impounded. Your crew will be confined to quarters. and you will remain aboard the descending Wrath until Earth's government provides satisfactory explanation for your criminal activities." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. He'd been in enough bad situations to recognize when arguing would only make things worse. The Vrexian guards, because of course there were guards, Krelvax didn't go anywhere without an entourage of armed enforcers, moved to flank him with the smooth efficiency of soldiers who'd done this many times before. "This is a mistake," Marcus said quietly, which was probably the most diplomatic way to say, "You're about to regret this." "The mistake," Krelvax replied, "was yours. Remove him." And just like that, humanity's diplomatic mission transformed into a hostage situation, which was honestly par for the course in galactic politics. Earth's government filed the appropriate protests, submitted the required paperwork, and engaged in the kind of tedious diplomatic back and forth that accomplished absolutely nothing except generating documents. The Vrexian Empire responded with the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug, pointed out that Marcus had technically violated about 14 different regulations, and suggested that perhaps Earth should be more careful about where it sent its surveyors in the future. 3 weeks crawled past with the speed of a cosmic glacier. Earth sent increasingly stern messages. The Vrexian Empire sent back increasingly elaborate explanations of why they didn't care. Marcus remained confined to a reasonably comfortable cell aboard the descending Wrath, treated with the basic courtesy afforded to prisoners who might eventually become political bargaining chips. He was fed, allowed to exercise, and given access to news feeds so he could watch his own government fail repeatedly to secure his release. It was, all things considered, deeply depressing. Then, on the 22nd day of Marcus's captivity, something unexpected happened. The descending Wrath's traffic control received a docking request from a small human shuttle, the kind of single-pilot craft that was primarily useful for short hops between stations, and absolutely not for crossing the kind of distances required to reach Vrexian space from Earth. The request was polite, professional, and completely insane. "Requesting permission to dock," the transmission said, the voice female and unnervingly calm. "I'm here about Ambassador Webb." The traffic controller, a young Vrexian officer who'd been having a perfectly boring shift until that moment, stared at his screen like it had personally betrayed him. "Negative, human vessel. This is a restricted military zone. You are not authorized." "I understand that. I'm still requesting permission to dock. It's regarding a family matter." "Family matter?" The controller looked to his supervisor, who looked equally baffled. "This is a military flagship, not a—" "I'm aware of what it is. May I speak with General Krelvax?" There was something about the way she said it. Not demanding, not pleading. Just asking with the kind of confidence that suggested she expected the answer to be yes. The supervisor made the kind of decision that seemed reasonable at the time, and probably seemed much less reasonable in hindsight. He forwarded the request up the chain of command. Krelvax, reviewing tactical reports in his command center, received the message with a combination of confusion and amusement. A human had flown all the way to his flagship to discuss a family matter regarding the prisoner. It was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and he was genuinely curious which. "Let her dock," he said, which were the 3 words that set everything else in motion. "Bay 7, full security detail. If this is some kind of rescue attempt, I want it documented for the intelligence archives. It'll make an excellent training example." The shuttle docked 20 minutes later, with all the ceremony of a grocery delivery. The pilot emerged alone, which was the first interesting detail. The second interesting detail was that she was completely unarmed, carrying nothing except a simple data pad. The third interesting detail was the way she moved, not rushed, not hesitant, just walking with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. She was average height for a human, with dark hair pulled back in a practical style and clothes that suggested she dressed for comfort rather than diplomacy. No uniform, no insignia, nothing that identified her as military or government. She could have been an accountant or a teacher or literally anyone who decided that today was a good day to board a hostile, alien warship. The security detail escorted her through the ship's corridors, and she looked around with what seemed like genuine interest, as if she were on a museum tour rather than walking through a vessel designed for conquest. Crew members stopped to stare as she passed, because it wasn't every day you saw a human walking freely through the descending wrath. Most humans who came here were either prisoners or corpses, and she was clearly neither. The command center doors opened with a hydraulic hiss that was probably meant to be intimidating. The room beyond was all dark metal and tactical displays, designed to remind visitors that they were in the presence of military power that could reduce planets to rubble with a few well-placed commands. Officers worked at their stations with practiced efficiency, and at the center of it all stood General Krelvax. 8 feet of scaled authority, crossed his arms, and studied the human with the intensity of a predator examining something that might be food or might be poison. "I am General Krelvax," he said, his voice carrying across the command center like a declaration. "You requested an audience. You have 3 minutes to explain why you're here before I have you escorted to a cell next to Ambassador Webb." The woman smiled, which was not the reaction most people had when threatened by a Vrexian general. It wasn't a nervous smile or a defiant smile. It was the kind of smile you'd give an old friend who just told a moderately amusing joke. "I appreciate your time, General. I'm here to request my brother's release." The command center went very quiet. Someone coughed. Someone else tried not to laugh. Krelvax's expression did something complicated. "Your brother. Ambassador Webb is your brother, and you've come here to—" "What, exactly?" "Ask nicely and hope I'm overcome with sentimentality." "Something like that," she said pleasantly. "I'm offering an exchange. Release him, and you can take me instead. Same diplomatic value, fewer complications." "You have no diplomatic value," Krelvax pointed out, which was technically true. "You're a civilian who's just admitted to familial connections with a suspected spy. If anything, you've given me 2 prisoners instead of 1. That's not much of a negotiation." "You're right," she agreed, still smiling. "I'm not much of a negotiator, but I did bring something that might interest you." She held up the data pad, and one of the security officers immediately tensed, probably running calculations about whether it might be a weapon. She noticed and held it out, letting them scan it. After a moment, the officer nodded. "Just a standard data device, no explosives, no hidden transmitters." "I've been reading about your military career," she said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "Impressive record. 47 engagements, 47 victories. The siege of Talax IV was particularly clever, cutting off their supply lines while making it. Looked like engine failures. Very efficient." Krelvax's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've done your research." "I have," she confirmed. "I was especially interested in the blockade of the Kepler belt. The way you used the asteroid field to mask your fleet movements was textbook asymmetric warfare. Though if I'm being honest, there were 3 moments in that campaign where you were vulnerable to counterattack. Here," she tapped the data pad, and a holographic display appeared above it, showing star charts and fleet positions. At hour 17 of the blockade, your supply ships were exposed for approximately 40 minutes while repositioning. If the defenders had had better intelligence coordination, they could have flanked your position and forced a retreat. And here, during the third week, your command ship was isolated from the main fleet for 6 hours during a sensor malfunction. A surgical strike with fast attack craft would have been devastating. And this moment, at the end, your victory formation left your aft quadrants exposed for almost an entire day. It worked because nobody attacked, but it was a gamble that relied on your enemies being disorganized. The command center had gone from quiet to absolutely silent. Several officers had stopped what they were doing to stare at the display. Krelvax's expression had shifted from amused condescension to something harder to read. "You're criticizing my tactics," he said slowly. "I'm offering observations," she corrected. "Your victories are legitimate, but they're also instructive about your strategic preferences. You favor overwhelming force applied at critical junctures, which works beautifully against disorganized opponents. But you also rely on enemies making predictable choices. When they don't, you adapt well. But there's always that initial moment of vulnerability." She swiped through more displays, showing fleet movements, communication patterns, supply routes. For instance, your current deployment has your supply convoys following the same routes on a 6-day cycle. Very efficient logistically, but also very predictable. And your flagship moves in a patrol pattern that repeats every 11 days. Again, efficient, but predictable. Krelvax took a step forward, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You've been tracking my fleet." "For about 3 months," she said casually, as if this were a perfectly normal hobby. "Since the negotiations started, actually. I like to be prepared for various contingencies." "Prepared," Krelvax repeated, and there was an edge to his voice now. "You're telling me that you, a civilian, have been conducting surveillance on Vrexian military operations for 3 months, and you're admitting this to my face." "Well, yes," she said. "I figured honesty was important for building trust." Someone in the command center made a strangled noise that might have been a laugh or might have been horror. Krelvax stared at the human woman like she'd just sprouted a second head. "Building trust," he said flatly, "by confessing to espionage." "Is it espionage if I'm not working for any government?" she asked, tilting her head. "I was under the impression that was more of a freelance research project. Though I suppose the legal definitions might vary." Krelvax's jaw tightened. "Who sent you? Earth Intelligence, their military command?" "Nobody sent me," she said simply. "I came because you took my brother." "Your brother is a spy." "My brother is an ambassador who made some poor choices about where to send survey ships. There's a difference, though I understand why you might conflate the two. But regardless of his professional errors, he's my brother. So here I am." There was something in the way she said it. A fundamental certainty that made it clear this wasn't negotiable, wasn't debatable. She'd come because her brother was in trouble, and that was apparently reason enough to walk into the heart of enemy territory and start pointing out vulnerabilities in their military operations. Krelvax studied her for a long moment, his eyes calculating. "You realize I could simply execute you both as spies?" "You could," she agreed. "But you won't. You're too smart for that. Killing an ambassador creates diplomatic complications. Killing his civilian sister who voluntarily walked onto your ship creates a much bigger problem. It makes you look brutal rather than strategic. And your empire values appearances. Strategic brutality is acceptable. Random violence is not. It suggests weakness of control." She was still smiling, And Krelvax was starting to understand that the smile wasn't nervousness or bravado. It was genuine comfort, the expression of someone who'd thought this through very carefully and arrived at conclusions she was confident in. "You're very certain of yourself," he observed. "I'm certain of my research," she corrected. "I've spent 3 months learning how you think, General. I know your tactics, your patterns, your decision-making frameworks. You're consistent, which is usually a virtue in military leadership. But consistency also means predictability, and predictability creates opportunities. Opportunities for what? For people like me to make offers you can't refuse." Krelvax made a gesture, and the security officers moved closer to her. She didn't react, didn't even glance at them. Her entire focus remained on the general, as if they were the only 2 people in the room. "I think," Krelvax said carefully, "that you've made a critical miscalculation. You've come here alone, unarmed, and confessed to surveillance operations against the Vrexian Empire. You have no leverage, no bargaining position, and no apparent plan beyond hoping I'll be impressed by your audacity. That's not strategy. That's suicide with extra steps." "Is it?" she asked, and there was something new in her voice now, not threatening exactly, but not quite friendly either. "General, I have a question. Are you familiar with the human concept of pack bonding?" Krelvax blinked, which was not a response he'd been expecting to have. "Pack bonding? It's a psychological trait," she explained, as if lecturing a class. "Humans form strong emotional attachments to family groups. It's evolutionary. We're social primates who survived by protecting our relatives. And when something threatens our pack, we respond with disproportionate force. Not always smart force, not always strategic force, just overwhelming, unreasonable, creative force applied until the threat stops threatening." She took a step forward, and the security officers tensed, but she ignored them completely. "Earth's government follows rules, General. They file complaints, they negotiate, they work through proper channels. That's good for interstellar stability. But families don't work through proper channels. Families escalate." "Is that a threat?" Krelvax asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's an explanation," she said. "See, I'm not military. I'm not intelligence. I'm what humanity calls a freelance security consultant, which is a polite way of saying I solve problems that governments can't officially solve. I've done work in 17 systems, handled situations ranging from hostage negotiation to other things we don't discuss in polite company. I'm very good at my job, and I'm very good at it specifically because I don't follow the rules that constrain militaries and governments." She gestured at the holographic display still floating above her data pad. "I told you, I've been tracking your fleet for 3 months. What I didn't mention is what I did with that information. Would you like to know?" Krelvax didn't answer, but his eyes were locked on her now with the intensity of someone who just realized he might have made a mistake. "Your flagship has 17 critical vulnerabilities in its security architecture," she said conversationally. 4 of them are hardware exploits in your sensor grid. 3 are software backdoors in your communication protocols. The rest are human factors, let's call them. Did you know that 3 of your senior officers have gambling debts with stations in neutral space? Very reasonable debts, nothing too suspicious, but enough that they were willing to accept some extra credit in exchange for information. Just routine stuff, shift schedules, patrol patterns, maintenance windows. Nothing that would seem important individually. The command center had gone very still. Several officers were looking at each other with expressions that suggested they were rapidly calculating which of their colleagues might be the compromised ones. Your life support system, she continued, has a fascinating vulnerability. There's a 14-minute window during the daily filtration cycle where the backup systems cycle offline for maintenance. During that window, someone with the right access codes could introduce contaminants into the air supply. Not lethal, I'm not a monster, but enough to make everyone aboard very uncomfortable for several hours. Difficult to trace back to the source, though. Might look like equipment failure. You're describing an attack on this vessel, Krelvax said, and his hand was now very close to the weapon at his belt. I'm describing possibilities, she corrected. Things that could happen if someone wanted them to happen. But here's the really interesting part, General. Remember that shuttle I arrived in? She smiled, and it was not a comforting expression. It's not actually a shuttle. Well, it is, technically. But it's also a delivery system for something creative. Krelvax's hand stopped moving. Explain. Inside my ship is a quantum cascade device. Are you familiar with temporal distortion technology? Probably not. It's very new, very experimental, and very illegal in most jurisdictions. The Viridian Conclave has been working on it for about 6 years, and they're very protective of the research. But if you know the right people, and you're willing to pay the right prices, you can acquire interesting things. She tilted her head, studying his expression. The device creates a localized temporal distortion field with a radius of about 500 meters. Everything inside that field experiences time at a dramatically reduced rate, about 1,000th of normal speed. From the outside, you'd appear frozen. From the inside, the universe would seem to be moving impossibly fast. Subjectively, you'd be conscious and aware for what would feel like centuries, while mere hours passed in the outside world. The command center was no longer just quiet. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room is simultaneously realizing they might be in serious danger. You'd be alive, she continued calmly, fully aware, unable to move at any meaningful speed, unable to communicate, unable to do anything except think and wait and experience every subjective moment of imprisonment in your own frozen time stream. It's not death, it's worse. It's conscious eternity in a moment. And when the effect finally ends, everyone inside will emerge having experienced thousands of years of sensory deprivation, while the rest of the universe aged a few weeks. Krelvax's expression had gone very carefully neutral. You're claiming you brought a temporal weapon onto my flagship. I'm claiming I spent 6 weeks preparing for this conversation, General. You took my brother. I had time to be creative. Security, Krelvax said sharply. Scan her shuttle. Full analysis. I want to know what's aboard that craft. Officers scrambled to comply, fingers flying over consoles as sensors focused on the small shuttle docked in Bay 7. The results came back in less than 2 minutes, and the officer reading them had gone pale, which was impressive for a species whose skin tone was naturally greenish-gray. Sir, the officer said carefully, there's a device matching the description. Quantum signature consistent with temporal distortion technology. It's active. Low-power standby mode, but armed and synchronized to a remote trigger. The command center exploded into activity. Officers shouting questions, security personnel moving toward exits, someone triggering an alert that sent warning lights flashing throughout the ship. Krelvax raised one hand, and the chaos immediately subsided. His crew knew better than to panic in front of him, even when panic was arguably the appropriate response. Explain, Krelvax said, his voice very quiet and very dangerous. Why I shouldn't have you shot right now and worry about the device later. Because shooting me triggers the device, she said simply. My biometric signature is one of the safeties. If my heart stops, or if I don't input a reset code every 12 hours, or if I don't disable it properly, the cascade initiates automatically. And before you consider trying to disarm it remotely, you should know that the device is quantum locked to my neural patterns. Any tampering triggers an immediate activation. The Viridians are very thorough about preventing their toys from being stolen. She looked around the command center, at the officers frozen at their stations, at the security detail with weapons half drawn, at Krelvax standing rigid with calculations running behind his eyes. I didn't come here to negotiate, General. I came here to present you with a very simple choice. You can release my brother and let us both leave peacefully, in which case I deactivate the device and we all go home. Or you can refuse, in which case I trigger the device, and everyone in this command center gets to experience subjective millennia of frozen consciousness. I'll experience it too, of course. But I came here knowing that was a possibility, and I made peace with it before I docked. You're insane, someone whispered from one of the consoles. I'm motivated, she corrected, still looking at Krelvax. There's a difference. Insanity is unpredictable. I'm very predictable. I will do literally anything to protect my family. Earth's government won't start a war over one ambassador, but I'm not the government. I'm just someone who loves her brother enough to make both our lives very complicated, if that's what it takes. Krelvax stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the calculations running behind his eyes. He was a brilliant strategist, a master tactician, someone who'd built a career on understanding his opponents and exploiting their weaknesses. But everything in his experience told him that people were rational actors who valued their own survival. This human woman had just demonstrated that she was willing to accept mutual destruction as an acceptable outcome. And that changed every calculation he could make. You're bluffing, he said. But there was uncertainty in his voice. Am I? She asked. General, you've spent your career studying military engagements. I've spent 3 months studying you. You rely on predictable behavior from your opponents. You assume they'll choose survival over principle. But humans don't always work that way. We're irrational. We escalate for emotional reasons. We make decisions that don't make strategic sense because we value things that can't be quantified. She took another step forward, and this time nobody moved to stop her. I'm not bluffing. I'm telling you exactly what will happen. You release Marcus, we leave, everyone lives. You refuse, and we all experience something that makes death look comfortable. Those are your options. Choose. The silence that followed was the kind that makes time feel thick and heavy. Krelvax's hand hovered near his weapon, but he didn't draw it. His officers waited for orders, but he didn't give any. And the human woman just stood there, calm and patient, as if she had all the time in the universe. Finally, Krelvax spoke, his voice carefully controlled. If I agree to these terms, what guarantee do I have that you'll actually deactivate the device? None, she said honestly. You have my word, which isn't worth much to you since we've just met, but consider this. If I wanted to trigger the device, I could have done it already. I came here for a specific purpose, to get my brother back, that's all. I'm not interested in destroying your ship or starting a war. I just want my family safe. Help me do that, and we both get what we want. Krelvax looked at her for a long moment, then at his officers, then back at her. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of someone making a decision he deeply resented, but couldn't avoid. Bring the ambassador to the command center. Now. It took 7 minutes for Marcus to arrive, escorted by guards who looked extremely uncomfortable. He was still in the simple civilian clothes he'd been wearing since his capture. Still had the careful composure of a diplomat who'd learned not to show weakness. Then he saw his sister standing in the middle of the Vrexian command center, and his entire face went through several complicated emotions in rapid succession. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp with a mixture of relief and horror. She smiled at him, the same warm expression she'd been using all along. "Hi, Marcus. Miss me?" "You need to leave," he said urgently, moving toward her despite the guards trying to hold him back. "Right now. Whatever you're planning." "Already planned," she interrupted. "We're leaving together. General Krelvax has agreed to release you." Marcus looked at Krelvax, then back at his sister, then around at the command center filled with tense Vrexian officers. "What did you do?" "Had a conversation," she said lightly. "We reached an understanding. She brought a temporal weapon onto my flagship," Krelvax said flatly, "and threatened to trap everyone aboard in a temporal prison unless I released you. Your sister is either brilliant or completely insane, and I haven't determined which." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, as if pained. "Of course she did. The general asked me who I was," she said, still smiling. "I told him I'm your sister, and your death if necessary. But we're going with the sister option today, so everyone wins." "Nobody wins in this scenario," Krelvax growled. "This is extortion." "This is family," she corrected. "You took someone I care about. I responded proportionally. Well, disproportionately. But that's kind of humanity's thing. We don't really do proportional responses when family is involved. We escalate until the problem stops being a problem." She turned to Marcus, her expression softening slightly. "Come on, let's go home." "The device," Krelvax said sharply. "You will deactivate it before you leave this ship." She considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. Marcus, go wait by the shuttle. I'll handle this." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression made him stop. He knew that look, had known it since they were children. It was the look that said arguing would be pointless. He left, escorted by guards who seemed relieved to have at least one prisoner leaving voluntarily. Once he was gone, she pulled out her datapad and began entering commands. The Vrexian officers watched the screens showing her shuttle, where sensors detected the quantum device powering down, its dangerous potential bleeding away into nothing. After a moment, one officer confirmed. "Device is deactivating. Quantum signature dropping to inert levels." "There," she said, lowering the datapad. "All done. No temporal prisons today. Everyone gets to experience time at normal speed." Krelvax moved closer to her, looming over her with the full weight of his presence. "You came onto my ship, threatened my crew, and extracted a prisoner through blackmail. You realize I could still have you executed." "You could," she agreed calmly. "But you won't. Because I've proven something important today, General. I've proven that humans are capable of things you didn't predict, that will do things that don't make strategic sense when family is involved. And more importantly, I've proven that your intelligence about humanity is incomplete. You know our militaries, our governments, our official positions. But you don't know what individual humans are capable of when properly motivated." She held his gaze without flinching. "Let me leave, General. Let Marcus and me go home. Because if you don't, you'll have to explain to your superiors how a single human civilian infiltrated your flagship, identified multiple security vulnerabilities, and forced you to release a prisoner through threat of mutual destruction. That's not a conversation you want to have. It makes you look weak. It makes your entire military look weak." Krelvax's expression was stone, but she could see the truth in his eyes. He'd been outmaneuvered, and they both knew it. "Leave," he said finally. "Take your brother and leave my ship. If I ever see either of you again, I will not be so accommodating." "You won't see me unless you take another human without proper cause," she said. "I don't make threats, General. I make promises. And here's my promise. Humanity's governments will follow proper channels. They'll negotiate, they'll file complaints, they'll do things by the book. But if you hurt one of us, there's always the possibility that someone like me will decide the rules don't apply anymore. Remember that before you take the next human prisoner." She turned and walked toward the exit, and this time nobody tried to stop her. The command center doors closed behind her with that same hydraulic hiss, and she was gone. Krelvax stood in the center of his command center, surrounded by officers who were very carefully not making eye contact with him, and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine uncertainty about an opponent's capabilities. "Sir," one officer ventured carefully, "should we pursue?" "No," Krelvax said after a long moment. "Let them go." "But sir, she compromised our security. She demonstrated capabilities we didn't know humans possessed." Krelvax interrupted. "That's valuable intelligence, even if it's uncomfortable to acquire. And more importantly, she demonstrated something about human psychology that we need to understand." He pulled up a holographic display showing the departing shuttle, 2 human signatures aboard, moving away from the descending wrath at a steady, unhurried pace. Humans escalate irrationally when family is involved. They ignore consequences, ignore strategic logic, ignore their own survival instincts. That's not a weakness. That's a different kind of strength, one we need to account for. The shuttle cleared the flagship's defensive perimeter and jumped to FTL, vanishing into the distorted space that made interstellar travel possible. Krelvax watched it go, then turned back to his command center. "New directive," he said. "All intelligence assessments of human targets must now include family structure analysis. If a human has living relatives, threat level is automatically elevated. We avoid taking human prisoners unless absolutely necessary. And when we do, we prepare for potential irrational responses from family units." "Sir," another officer said hesitantly, "are we really changing military doctrine because of one woman?" Krelvax looked at him with an expression that suggested the question was stupid. That one woman brought a temporal weapon onto this ship and was fully prepared to trap herself and everyone aboard in frozen time to save her brother. Yes, we're changing doctrine. Because if there are more humans like her, we need to know about it before we find out the hard way. He pulled up the security footage from the command center, studying the human woman's face, her calm expression, her absolute certainty. "She wasn't afraid," he said quietly. "That's what bothers me most. She walked onto a hostile warship, threatened a general, and never showed a moment of fear. Either she's psychologically abnormal, or humans are capable of much more controlled aggression than we believed." "Both possibilities are concerning, sir." "Agreed." Krelvax closed the display and turned back to his officers. "Update all tactical databases, new human threat assessment protocols, and someone find out who those 3 officers with gambling debts are. I want them in my office within the hour." The command center returned to its normal operations. But there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. The uncomfortable awareness that they'd just been played by an opponent they'd underestimated completely. Meanwhile, aboard the departing shuttle, Marcus sat in the co-pilot's seat and stared at his sister with an expression that mixed exasperation, relief, and genuine awe. "A temporal weapon," he said. "You brought a temporal weapon onto a Vrexian flagship?" "Technically, it was a bluff," she said, focusing on the navigation display. "Well, 60% a bluff. The device was real, but the quantum lock to my neural patterns was creative fiction. I figured they wouldn't have time to verify the technical specifications before making a decision." Marcus absorbed this information in silence for a moment. "So, if he'd called your bluff, then I would have triggered it anyway and hoped the effect wasn't as bad as I claimed. But honestly, I spent 6 weeks building that device, and I wasn't entirely sure it would work at all. Quantum mechanics is complicated, and the Viridian schematics I bought were partially corrupted. There was a 30% chance it would just explode instead of creating temporal distortion. 30%. Maybe 40. The math was unclear." Marcus put his head in his hands. "You risked both our lives on a device that might have just exploded." "I risked both our lives on the assumption that Krelvax values his reputation more than his pride," she corrected. "The device was just the mechanism. The real weapon was understanding how he thinks. He couldn't accept being outmaneuvered by a civilian, so he had to take the deal to avoid looking weak. Psychology, not technology." "You're insane." "I prefer creatively problem-solving," she said with a slight smile. "Besides, you'd have done the same for me." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Yeah, I would have. Which is probably why we're both terrible at our jobs. You're excellent at your job. You're just also excellent at getting captured. It's a very specific skill set." Despite everything, Marcus laughed. "Fair point. So what happens now? Earth's government is going to want a full debrief, and I'm not sure how to explain that my sister committed about 14 different interstellar crimes to extract me." "We tell them the truth," she said. "That the Vrexian Empire released you after private negotiations. They don't need to know the details of those negotiations. And Krelvax won't tell them either. He can't admit what happened without looking foolish. So, officially, this was a diplomatic success. Everyone wins. Except for the part where you've made an enemy of one of the galaxy's most dangerous military leaders." "I've made him cautious of humans," she corrected. "There's a difference. He'll think twice before taking another human prisoner, because now he knows we're unpredictable. That's not a bad outcome strategically." Marcus shook his head, but he was smiling now. "You know, most siblings just send care packages when you're in trouble. Maybe a nice fruit basket." "Fruit baskets are for amateurs," she said. "I prefer temporal weapons and psychological warfare. More memorable." They flew in comfortable silence for a while, the stars stretching into lines as the FTL drive carried them away from Vrexian space. Behind them, Krelvax was probably writing new military doctrine. Ahead of them, Earth was waiting with questions they'd have to answer carefully. But for now, they were safe. They were together, and the universe had learned an important lesson. Humans don't negotiate when family's involved. They escalate, and sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy isn't a warship or a bomb or a temporal distortion device. Sometimes it's just a sibling who knows exactly how far they're willing to go and refuses to stop until they get there.